Okay, A pushers, this is our very last lesson. This is 9.3, and it is about the new millennium. And I will be honest, I have not seen a lot of this show up on the AP exam, partially just because it's too recent and there are maybe bigger things that they want to talk about, like the ending of the Cold War, that comes from this time period. But I want to make sure that you guys are familiar with it so that if there are any questions that pop up, that you are able to utilize it. Also, it's really good for synthesis using on your essays. So let's go ahead and get started. So the new millennium was actually something that people were very nervous of because there was a potential glitch that was having to do with computers. So this bug was known as Y2K, standing for the year 2000. And the problem was that computers only had 2 digits at the end of like where they, set dates. And so when the clock would run over from 1999 to the year 2000, people were afraid that the computers would think that it was the year 1900 because it would just have those last 2 digits. And people were really freaked out. They were like, maybe computers won't work. Maybe that means that banks are going to fail. Maybe that means that, all these other digital communications that we rely on so much by this point are all just going to suddenly stop working. Turns out computers are smarter than we thought they were, and they were able to make the changeover from 1999 to 2000 just fine. But there really truly was a great fear about what was going to happen in the year 2000 and beyond. And the first president that we're going to be focusing on is going to be George W. Bush, who is the son of George Herbert Walker Bush. So Herbert Walker Bush was 41st president. George W. Bush is going to be the 43rd, so he will be referred to as 43. He'll be referred to as George W., or he will sometimes just be referred to as W. And I refer to him usually as Baby Bush. So let's talk about him. It all starts actually pretty contested. So in the year 2000, the election is going to be between George W. Bush and the current Vice President of the United States, Al Gore. And the problem is that there is no clear winner. Neither side got the required 270 electoral votes to win. Now, Al Gore narrowly won the popular vote of 48% to 47%, but the results in Florida were just too close to call. And so because of that, their state law required the recount of ballots using these vote counting machines. The problem is that they couldn't necessarily count all of the ballots because those ballots had this punch card system. And if they did not have a completely clear punch through the paper, then the machine couldn't read it. So a whole bunch of these were getting thrown out because the counting machines were not able to read them. That means that people's votes were not being counted. So November 26th, the state of Florida certifies and says Bush is the winner by a whopping 537 votes. 537 people decided the presidency. So next time you feel like your vote doesn't count, trust me, it does. So that means that Bush now wins the election with 271 electoral votes, which you need 270 to win. So he barely squeaked past this. Now, a lot of people said that there was some controversy behind this. First of all, a lot of those votes didn't get read, and that means that people who cast their ballots might have cast their ballots for Al Gore, and that might have swung the election in his favor. The other thing that people were concerned with is that the governor of Florida, where this was happening, was Jeb Bush, who is George W. Bush's brother. So Al Gore is going to be demanding that there is a hand recount. And so this hand recount, they are going to be trying to determine whether that actually is a vote for Gore or for Bush. And what they were trying to read were something called the hanging chads. So basically, that little piece of paper that didn't fully get punched through. And this was, I mean, really controversial, so much so that after the state of Florida called it for George W. Bush, Al Gore actually is going to bring this to the Supreme Court and sue for the presidency. And so this is the Supreme Court case of Bush v. Gore. So in this case, the Supreme Court ruled 7-2 that the hand recounts of Florida violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, essentially saying that some votes were counted by the machine, some votes were counted by hand, and that's not fair and equal to all voters. They also voted 5-4 that there was just not enough time to conduct a full manual recount before the day that the president would need to actually enter into the White House. So that means George W. Bush is going to enter into the White House barely, and that is going to really leave him with kind of a contested election and already a contested presidency from the very beginning. So here we see that final electoral count. So what are some of the things he does in office? Well, the first of these is going to be the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Act, better known as the Bush tax cuts. So he feels that taxes are too high. And since coming from the Clinton era, the economy is doing great, there's no reason for us to have these really, really high taxes. But what this is it's basically Reaganomics 2.0. It's slashing the income tax rate. It's going to lower taxes, but what it's going to really do is lower the taxes mostly for the wealthiest individuals, as well as people who have lots of stocks, lots of investments, and especially corporations are going to have lower taxes. And the idea is, as we've seen before, that this is going to trickle down to the masses. But as we have seen in the past, it didn't actually trickle down, and it ends up creating immense debt. And that's because not only were we still spending a lot of money on domestic programs like welfare and healthcare, like Medicare, Social Security, etc., but also that we were going to be in the middle of a war, and that is going to be something that has an immense impact. The other domestic policy that he's going to be known for is No Child Left Behind, or NCLB. You guys are very well familiar with this because this is the educational system that you grew up in. No Child Left Behind is the reason why you have had so many standardized tests when you were little kids. So these were annual reading and math tests that were in grades 3 through 8. The idea was we wanted to ensure that every child in America was getting a quality education. There is, because we're 50 separate states with 50 separate educational policies, there's just a lot of differentiation into what kids learn and at what time and things like this. And so this program was well intentioned. It was going to make sure that all kids in America, regardless of where they lived, was going to get a quality education. The schools, in order to show that they were actively trying to improve their school and their students' understanding, had to improve their testing scores every year. And so what ended up happening is that these low-performing schools could potentially have their entire staff let go, have their entire staff fired if there was not significant improvement every single year. And they would be replaced by other people who had been essentially hired by the government. And this, as you might guess, totally freaks out teachers because they're realizing their job relies on how well a kid does on the test. So that would be essentially as if like my paycheck depended on if you guys pass the AP exam. And if you get a 3, 4, or 5, that would determine if I got paid more or less. That's essentially what No Child Left Behind was kind of doing. So what that does is it incentivizes schools to cheat. And they did, because they were so terrified of having low scores and of having people who were not going to be improving their school's overall grade score. So teachers would tell kids the correct answers or go back and erase and correct kids' answers. That schools would encourage low performing students to not attend school on the days that there was testing. And there was so much cheating in the system that it became very clear very fast that this was well intended but completely failed. And it has since been repealed and has been replaced. So we are going to be looking at specifically the event that's really going to be the biggest event for Bush's administration, and that is going to be the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, what you need to understand about Afghanistan is that it is nicknamed the graveyard of empires, and that is because they have been conquered and reconquered and conquered and reconquered for about probably 1,000 years. And because of that, they have just not really had a lot of opportunities to control themselves and to make their own decisions. And that is part of the reason why they have struggled politically as a nation. So after they have been conquered by just about everybody, they are going to have the opportunity to rule themselves. However, there is going to be an invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets in 1980. And we are going to, want to do something about this. And so there are people in Afghanistan who are asking for America's help. And this group of people are known as the Mujahideen. So Mujahideen are a group of rebel fighters who are trying to get rid of the Soviets in their country. And the United States, we're all about this because goodness knows we want any opportunity to, stick it to the Soviets. So we go ahead and we send them guns and we send them money and we, have them trained by the CIA and by the US military, and then we leave. And we don't stick around until the job is done. And the Mujahideen are going to see this as as us abandoning them in their time of need. And they feel that the United States has kind of gone back on its word to protect them. And so that's going to create a lot of hatred and anger towards the United States. They are eventually able to kick the Soviets out of the country, but it does lead to just this period of anger towards the U.S. Many of the people that are left behind are now, the Soviets are no longer there, but there's no real stable government either. And so it leaves this vacuum of political leadership. And so all of those warlords who had been fighting with the Mujahideen are now going to start fighting amongst themselves and each other in order to see who's going to be the ruler of Afghanistan. So now, while all these warlords are fighting amongst themselves and fighting amongst each other about, who's going to run Afghanistan, there is a group of these former Mujahideen who are now going to leave the country, and they are going to go to nearby Pakistan. And in Pakistan, there is a very old school, very strict version of Islam that's being taught. And these individuals are going to think that this version of Islam is what needs to happen in their country in order to bring everybody kind of back to where they need to be, and bring peace and prosperity to their nation. And so they are going to formulate an organization in order to meet this goal. And that group is going to be known as the Taliban. And so this is this fundamentalist Islamic group. They are going to go into Afghanistan and they are going to systematically take control. Now, kind of think of them like a political party almost. And they're going to be, in many ways, the ruling group in Afghanistan, even though they are not necessarily the ones who, quote unquote, run the government. They are essentially still running the country. And they are going to be supportive of and fund a lot of radical Islamic terrorist groups as a way to bring their version of Islam to the country and to the surrounding countries. This form of Islam is going to follow what is called Sharia law, which is, like I said, a very old school, very restrictive, very harsh set of laws. That's very medieval. It's the kind of thing where, if you get caught stealing, they're going to cut the hand, your hand off that you stole whatever that thing was with. So it's very barbaric in a lot of ways. But their idea was this is going to be the true version of Islam, and that's what's going to make their country successful. Within these groups and within the Taliban, like I said, they're going to be supporting these terrorist groups. And one of these terrorist groups is going to be known as Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is led by a wealthy Saudi Arabian exile by the name of Osama bin Laden. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is going to set us up for one of the most dramatic and devastating events in American history. September 11th, 2001. I know that you guys were infants at best when this happened, so you don't really have any memory of it. But this was a moment that the nation stood still. It was, in many ways, to many Americans, completely unexpected. Now, the U.S. intelligence agencies, they knew that there were these terrorist groups. They knew that they had threatened the United States in the past and even attempted to attack the United States in the past. But if you ask the average American about what were the chances of America being attacked, they probably would have just laughed in your face, because there was no expectation of this. We believed America was essentially invincible. Who would be dumb enough to do this? America is rich. America is militarily powerful. We've defeated the Soviets. Nobody would be dumb enough to touch us. And yet, on a Tuesday morning, 19 terrorists from the Al-Qaeda terrorist group, they hijacked 4 planes, and they flew them into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and one would crash into a field in Pennsylvania. Watching this happen live on television was an absolutely world-changing and life-changing event for many, many Americans, and I can say that very much for myself included. I remember every single thing about that day. I remember hearing on the radio about this plane that flew into the World Trade Center, and how, people didn't know if, what had gone wrong with the plane for this to happen, and they were trying to get people out of the building as quickly as they could. And then as I'm listening, they say, oh my God, another plane has just hit the other World Trade Center tower. And that's the moment that you knew this wasn't an accident, it wasn't a mistake. And I rushed into my classroom, and I sat there with the rest of my class and just watched it on TV the entire school day. And we watched as these buildings caught fire, and how the people that were inside them had no way out. And many of them did, in their desperation, start jumping from the buildings in an attempt to escape the flames. And we sat and watched in horror as these crashed to the ground. And when that occurred, people, there was a gasp and then silence. And we knew that this had killed hundreds of people, if not more. We then are hearing word about there being a plane crash at the Pentagon that also killed many people, and that there was a 4th plane that had been hijacked, and it had turned itself around and was headed towards Washington, D.C., the likely target being either Congress or the White House. And the people that were on the plane had actually been able to get information and get the news about what had been happening in New York and at the Pentagon. And they realized that their plane was one of the ones that had been hijacked. And so the people on the plane, they actually took control and they sacrificed themselves to drive this plane into the ground in a field in Pennsylvania so that it would not be able to reach its target in Washington, D.C. When the buildings collapsed in New York, however, New York is filled with millions of people, and so they had to get all those people out. And there was a mass exodus out of Manhattan to try and escape from the flames and escape from the attack. And there were a lot of people who were unable to get in touch with their family members and their friends to let them know that they were safe. And there are, story after story after story of close call. My high school best friend, her dad was supposed to be on one of those flights. He accidentally slept through his alarm that day and missed his flight. So it was something where there were people who were alive simply because of those very small little changes in their patterns. And then there were also so many people who had died just going about their daily business. And so because of this, the United States has to decide how to respond. So not long after the attacks had occurred, it became clear who was responsible for it. And that was Osama bin Laden and his terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda. And the United States now had an enemy. The United States now had somebody that we needed to track down and make them take responsibility for the 2,000 Americans who died in this tragic event. Following this, there is going to be a massive upsurge in patriotism. We could see this very similar to the jingoism that we saw during the period following the Spanish-American War. Although this was clearly not a military victory for us, there is still this upsurge and this swell of patriotism because we see ourselves as united against a common enemy. We also see this very similar to the effect of that upsurge of patriotism in America following the attack at Pearl Harbor. Again, we have a common enemy. We have somebody who has wronged us, and we need to stand together to protect ourselves and each other as a nation. And so, Congress is going to try and figure out how in the world did this very highly coordinated attack, how is it possible? And, to get 19 of these people on American planes, get them, to be able to hijack the planes and destroy these buildings, that takes a lot of organization. How did we not know? And so Congress is going to pass something called the USA Patriot Act. The USA Patriot Act actually is a hugely long acronym. It stands for Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. The USA Patriot Act. And the whole point of this was giving the government the authority to monitor citizens and to apprehend potential terrorists. And those potential terrorists do not have habeas corpus. So here are a couple of quick things that we can see this as a similarity to. One is that the Patriot Act does limit in many ways your freedom of speech. They're going to monitor online behavior. They're going to do data mining. They're going to listen in on people's phone conversations. They're going to hack people's text messages and emails and things like this. This is very similar to what we've seen many, many times in American history with things like the Sedition Act that we saw during World War I. We saw this back in the 1700s with the Alien and Sedition Act when we were afraid of the French. And so that's a very similar situation that we are going to see. The other thing that we should see this as a similarity to, that we are going to see a similarity is following World War II's Pearl Harbor attack, where suddenly, America is going to become incredibly fearful of anybody of Japanese ancestry. the United States is going to become equally afraid of anybody that is from Middle Eastern ancestry, and that they are going to be unfairly targeted by U.S. Police forces and security systems to see if they have any potential ties to terrorism. And this is something that we are still dealing with today, 18 years later. And the Patriot Act was a lot more in depth than a lot of Americans realized, and it would be revealed by Edward Snowden in 2013 just how much of your information that the government was able to have contact with and have control of and being able to see. A lot of people would equate his revealing of this information. He basically stole a bunch of information from the Department of Defense, and he released it to the public, to the press. And so a lot of people would make that seen as a comparison to the Pentagon Papers release done by Daniel Ellsberg back in the 1970s about Vietnam. So this is now going to lead us to the war that America has been in pretty much your entire lives. The war on terror is going to be created not long following the actual attacks on the World Trade Center in 2001. And one of the first things that's going to happen is the government is going to create an entirely new secretarial position in order to protect the nation, and that is going to be the Department of Homeland Security. So they're going to be kind of alongside the Department of Defense. However, their job is to make sure that there is safety here at home, not necessarily defense abroad. This is going to then also start with a war in Afghanistan. And the war in Afghanistan starts on October 7th, 2001, where the U.S. is going to bomb targets to attack al-Qaeda's camps and Taliban military forces. By December, the Taliban regime has collapsed. And we actually help create a new government that's based kind of in our own image in Afghanistan. There's going to be people who feel that this is maybe not the best idea because we've done this before and it has not necessarily always turned out well when the United States places a leader in power in a foreign nation. Great example would be our placement of the president in South Vietnam that led up to the Vietnam War. And so because of this very kind of quick turnaround, President Bush is going to say that, hey, it's mission accomplished. We've defeated al-Qaeda and the Taliban, except we didn't. We didn't actually defeat them. We just severely weakened them in Afghanistan, and we severely weakened their ability to operate in Afghanistan. But we did not destroy their organizations, and their organizations escaped to places like Pakistan, where they continued to operate and grow and teach people and radicalize them so that they too would want to fight against the United States. And so we have thousands of American troops that are in Afghanistan, and we're now acting kind of as peacekeeper, as well as we are also hunting for Osama bin Laden. And during this period of time, al-Qaeda is going to launch guerrilla warfare against U.S. troops, where they're going to be using things like IEDs, which are these kind of like homemade bombs that are going to be, really devastating for our troops. This can also be seen as a similarity to Vietnam in the sense that we are not fighting the Afghani military. We are not fighting the military of Afghanistan. We're fighting against a guerrilla warfare group. We're against guerrilla troops who look like civilians and use civilians as human shields in order to fight against our soldiers. So very similar to fighting against the Viet Cong during Vietnam. And then that leads us to the war in Iraq. Now, the Bush doctrine said that America would strike first in quote unquote anticipatory self defense against aggressive nations. And he says that Iran, North Korea, and Iraq are the quote unquote axis of evil, and that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that are making America unsafe, and that they are helping fund Al Qaeda. So that's where this is going to lead America into a war in Iraq. There is this belief that Saddam Hussein had hidden these weapons of mass destruction, so chemical weapons, biological weapons, etc., and was going to give them to Al Qaeda to use. So the U.S. marches in, we attack Iraq, we seize control of the country, and we are able to capture Saddam Hussein by the end of the year in 2003. And that's the picture that you see of him at the bottom there. We found him hiding in like a little spider hole in the ground, and that was, it was surprising for us to find him there because he was a man who had, lived such a lavish life and had so much power. But it became evident quite clearly and very soon that there were no weapons of mass destruction, nor was there any serious link between Saddam Hussein and Al Qaeda, and that a lot of this had actually been organized and had been created and had been invented in many ways by the vice president himself, Dick Cheney. And he and high-ranking members of the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, had organized this so that they could take out Saddam Hussein, who they felt had unfairly been able to avoid any kind of punishment following the Persian Gulf War that was under George W. Bush's father, George Herbert Walker Bush. And so there really was no mission accomplished. There also was no plan for how to rebuild Iraq. And so because of this, the two sides of, or two major kind of groups of Muslims in the country, the Sunni and the Shia, are fighting for control and fighting the United States. And that makes things that much more unstable in this country. And that's going to come back to bite us a little bit later on, which we'll see at the end of this lesson here. There's also going to be a lot of controversy that comes from this war that doesn't have anything to do with the actual fighting or the reasons of going into the war, but rather our behavior as Americans. And a great example of this is going to be how the people that we capture are going to be treated. There are these pictures that are going to become released that are seen by the public and seen by being published in newspapers and in the media of how these prisoners are being treated. And they're being denied food, denied water, denied sleep, that they are being held in these incredibly uncomfortable physical conditions, as well as that there is a large amount of humiliation that is being used against them to try and get them to cooperate. And then it goes even further than that when we find out that there are even examples of waterboarding, or what we called back in the Philippine-American War at the turn of the century, the water cure. And these quote-unquote advanced interrogation methods were okayed by the government, by the by the president, and by members of the military and the CIA to say this is what was necessary to get the information that we needed. However, this is going to severely damage America's reputation around the world. We have always upheld ourselves as being a country that does not torture, and yet it's pretty hard for anybody to look at these pictures and say that these are not examples of torture. And then finally, part of the reason why this war is going to be different from the wars that we have seen before is that it is going to be quite deadly for our soldiers. It is going to be dangerous for them, and there are going to be a lot who are going to die. But as I talked to you guys about in class, you never see pictures of the bodies coming home. You never see video of them in battle. You never see anything that shows our soldiers actually being in any real danger. Why? Because we learned our lesson from Vietnam. The government knew that if they showed these to the public, that it would cause a decline in support. And that is why Congress passed a ban on showing the coffins coming home to the United States. The photograph that you see here was actually taken in secret by a journalist. And that journalist was prosecuted after this for showing these images of soldiers' coffins being brought back home, because it could be damaging to the country's support of the war, almost seen as sedition. And so these are things that we need to kind of keep in mind as we are learning about this war, is that it has so many connections to America's participation in previous wars. Now, meanwhile, all this is happening, George W. Bush has a second term. He has been reelected, and it's not going to be really that much easier for him. First of all, we have Hurricane Katrina, which was the most devastating hurricane that we had seen in a really long time. But what was even worse about it was the fact that the levees that are supposed to keep floodwaters at bay had been deteriorating for years, and there had not been money put forth to fix them. And those levees broke, and that led to massive flooding, and the water was rising, and thousands of people died because of these floods and because of the hurricane, and being unable to get to safety. And FEMA, who, which by the way is known as the Federal Emergency Management Association or Agency, their job is to provide the emergency equipment for these, for these events. But it was really slow in getting that approved. George W. Bush was like, don't worry about it. Louisiana will figure it out. It's not that bad. And when it finally became very evident that it was that bad, in fact worse, when he finally did approve of these FEMA funds, for a lot of people, it was too little, too late. The other thing that's going to happen is in 2008, just at the very end of his term, we are going to have the beginning of the Great Recession. So the reason that this happened is because of very kind of unethical practices being done within the housing market that made things very unstable. There had also been kind of there had been too much speculation on businesses, especially those that were internet-based. And when all of these came kind of crashing down all at once, these major economic agencies, they, that had been around for well over 100 years, just vanished overnight. And people's livelihood, people's retirement, people's homes were, that was just gone. To understand kind of how this happens, I'm going to be posting a video for you guys that comes from the movie The Big Short, that will kind of explain what caused this housing collapse to happen, and it will help you guys understand kind of why this all comes crumbling down. Because when the housing market collapses, that's kind of the signal of how kind of healthy the economy is doing, and that reduces faith in the economy. The stock market starts to crash, and it just is this domino effect throughout the economy. In order to try and stop the bleeding, W is going to create the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, which a lot of people better know as the bank bailout, in order to ensure that some of these banks, big major banks like Bank of America, did not fail and close their doors because we just could not see another Great Depression. But that means that Baby Bush is going to be leaving office, and whoever takes office next is going to be facing the worst economic tragedy in American history since the Great Depression. And the person that's going to be coming into office is Barack Obama. And so we're going to very quickly go through this because I have yet to see anything from Obama's administration show up on the exam. But we're going to go through it real quick just in case something shows up. All right, so he is going to be going up against John McCain, who is a well-known senator. He's been in the Senate for forever and ever and ever. He is a Vietnam prisoner of war. In this election, McCain is going to be well known as he's this known as the maverick in the Senate. And he is known as being the person who kind of bucks the trend and puts country first, which is his slogan for this campaign. However, because he's he's older, he's also kind of from an older era of the Republican Party, he needs someone younger and part of this more still existing religious right to be his running mate. And so the person he picks is the governor of the state of Alaska, Sarah Palin, who has, while she has been the governor of Alaska, she doesn't have a lot of experience outside of her state. And this is seen as being kind of a weird choice for a lot of people, but it's because she is one of those conservative, moral majority right people that, he wants to be able to get in the election. Obama, on the other hand, is a former law professor, and he is a brand new senator with very little experience. A lot of people are equating him to JFK, not having a lot of experience going into his administration. He does win the primary against Hillary Clinton, one of the most well-known names in the Democratic Party. And she was a senator from New York, and she was well-known and well-respected. However, there were a lot of people who didn't like that there were so many scandals that were associated with her and her husband and her family, as well as that they saw her as being kind of more of the same of what we've had before. They wanted something new. They wanted something different. They wanted some change. And so that is what he is going to be running on. His slogan is "Change We Can Believe In." However, he had two kind of additional slogans. One of them was the famous Hope poster. And his other slogan that came from one of his speeches was "Yes, we can." And he is going to be very successful with this. He chooses a long-time senator, Joe Biden, who is incredibly well-known, incredibly well-respected, as his vice presidential candidate. So you've got on both of these sides, one person with a lot of experience, one person with not as much experience. One of them that is definitely the establishment, and one of them that is kind of the new face of that Democratic Party or Republican Party. When it comes down to it in the Electoral College, 53% of the popular vote goes to Barack Obama, and he is going to also at this same time be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009 for his extraordinary efforts to strengthen international diplomacy and cooperation between people. Essentially that he, with his message of hope and change, has created more peace in the world. And he is only the second American president to ever have received the Nobel Peace Prize, the other one being President Theodore Roosevelt. Now, going into office, he is going to inherit the Great Recession, which really sucks for him. In order to kickstart the economy, he puts in place the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. This is an economic stimulus package that is giving money to states and local governments to try and kickstart their economy and get it back on track. So it's very similar to the Federal Emergency Relief Act that we saw during the Great Depression and the New Deal, that had given money to the states to divvy out as they saw best. They're also going to have Dodd-Frank, Wall Street Reform, and the Consumer Protection Act. What this was it was a series of regulations on the financial industry and a new Consumer Protection Bureau that had been first introduced by a woman by the name of Elizabeth Warren, who is now a senator and currently running for president. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act was essentially trying to strengthen things we already had in place. For example, the Securities and Exchange Commission, whose job it is to kind of keep an eye on the stock market, this is now adding one more layer of protection in that realm. His next major thing that he's going to try and do is achieve something that Democrats have been trying to do since Harry Truman, and that is create universal health care. And that is going to be the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also known as the ACA, or also known as Obamacare. This was going to vastly increase the number of Americans who had health insurance, but it was very unpopular amongst conservatives and Republicans who thought that the mandate of it, basically, if you don't have this insurance, if you don't have insurance, then you get fined for it. And they thought that that was unfair. They also felt that it was a burden on small businesses. It was too difficult for small businesses to be able to do. The next thing that he is able to do is he is going to have the chance to nominate 2 people to the Supreme Court. 2 former justices are going to leave the court, and he is going to nominate 2 women. That is going to be Sonia Sotomayor, who you see on the far left, and Elena Kagan, who is on the far right. And in the middle is, at that time, the only woman who had been sitting on the Supreme Court, and that was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is actually still on the bench today. He's also going to have dedication to climate change and a clean power plan. The Clean Power Plan was to combat greenhouse gases and climate change. However, while this is going to pass through Congress, it is going to be blocked by the Supreme Court, and it is going to be severely limited by the current Trump administration. But we can see this as an expansion or an extension of what we saw in the 1970s of that environmentalist movement, that this is now kind of reaching ahead and people are saying something needs to change. Finally, as far as people who are going to be standing up to him or making things more difficult for him to accomplish these goals that he has, is going to be a new branch in the Republican Party known as the Tea Party. And Tea Party actually is an acronym for Taxed Enough Already. And the Tea Party originally was saying that they just wanted to lower taxes. But what it has evolved into, rather than just this faction within the Republican Party, it is now kind of evolved into a group of very kind of extreme right-wing conservatives that is now made up of kind of a new coalition. This is the religious right. This is free trade extremists. These are people who are also in favor of, generally in favor of more extreme racial divides. For example, that they want to limit people coming into the United States who are coming from non-white nations. So it has kind of become this new coalition within the Republican Party, and it is an extreme right-wing version of the Republican Party. We've seen this happen in political parties before, where there is a difference in them, and sometimes it does cause a split. Great example is going to happen in 1912 with Theodore Roosevelt, where the progressives in that party don't agree with the rest of the Republican Party, and so they break off and they are going to create their own party, the Progressive or Bull Moose Party. President Obama is also going to have a very combative Congress. It is going to be held by a majority of Republicans for a good portion of his time in office, and so not much is going to be able to get done through Congress. So instead, he uses his executive authority through the executive order. This, however, is going to be severely criticized, but has a great connection back to our dear friend Andrew Jackson, who was the king of using the veto. Um, I don't remember why I have this picture. Looking at Obama's foreign policy, on May 2nd, 2011, SEAL Team 6 is going to kill Osama bin Laden. This was a momentous event because for a lot of people, the fact that Osama bin Laden had gone so long without being caught after his planning and participation with the 9/11 attacks, people were quite thrilled to hear that this had happened successfully. And so not too long after that, in December of 2011, the very last combat troops are going to withdraw from Iraq. And this was also something that was very much celebrated, as a lot of people felt that this was part of that war on terror that really had not necessarily shown as much benefit or had as much reason for us to be there. The major problem is that when we did leave, we left the country relatively unstable, and that is going to be something that I'll talk more about in just a moment. One of the other issues is that there's a lot of controversy over Obama's usage of drone strikes. It was used to kill al-Qaeda leaders, as well as other enemies that were in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But it also killed a lot of innocent civilians. So a lot of people were saying that, that while Obama had said, the use of those quote unquote, enhanced interrogation methods under Bush's administration were torturous, a lot of people were saying, well, his use of drone strikes were just as bad. And so there was definitely a lot of controversy here at home, but it also spurs a lot of hatred and distrust towards the United States abroad. We're also going to see, starting in 2010 and then continuing through 2012, something that's known as the Arab Spring. This is very similar to what we saw in the satellite nations of the Soviet Union, where they were starting to have rebellions in the 1980s, leading up to the end of the Soviet Union. And what we see in the Arab nations is going to be a demand for greater democracy, just like we had seen in those satellite nations. So at this point, we are going to see the overthrow of dictators in places like Egypt and Tunisia and Libya and Yemen. And all of this is going to be spread through social media. That is how this movement got started. And so it's showing the power of social media and the power of kind of this global understanding of democracy. It was supported by the United States. However, these countries, once these rebellions and these revolutions had happened, overthrowing these dictators, the countries were left without stable leadership. And so that's going to lead to a lot of unrest. It's going to lead to warlords arising. It's going to lead to civil wars. And it's going to lead to the creation of ISIS. The rise of ISIS and Islamic extremism is still a concern. So ISIS is an ultra-violent, extremist, fundamentalist Islamic group that's focused on creating what they call a Muslim caliphate, basically a fundamentalist theocracy somewhere in the Middle East is kind of their goal. And this grew out of the chaos that came from America's withdrawal from Iraq, as well as the lack of leadership in the Arab Spring nations, as well as ethnic rivalries that were existing in many of these Middle Eastern countries. And ISIS will murder Westerners, including journalists and humanitarian workers, and they post the footage on social media and on YouTube. This has now led to there being not only some questions about the power of social media in kind of a negative point of view, but also that it is showing that America is not universally loved. In fact, what is going to happen is that there is a directive, essentially from the U.S. State Department, that says you are not to go to some of these areas because they are being held by ISIS. So only a couple of years ago, over 30% of Syria was controlled by ISIS. Now they have been virtually wiped out as far as their caliphate. However, the organization is still around and is still committing acts of terror around the world. So that is the end of this lesson and this lecture. I know that it's not a lot of stuff that's shown up on the AP exam, but I want you guys to be prepared for this, as well as it can be something that you use in an essay as part of your synthesis and style points. So I wish you guys luck on the AP exam, and I know you guys are going to do me proud.